So this is a really this is a pleasure to be here chairing this panel in particular for I would say 3 reasons. One, because it shows that the EBA is at the forefront of the relevant debates when it comes to financial law and financial regulation. 2, because the topic that we are going to address today is, I would say, an essential one for the future of European banking and capital markets law. And 3, because I think that when it comes to this topic, I could not have a better privilege than to discuss it with the 4 esteemed colleagues who accompany me today. So just to briefly mention and introduce them, because of course their accolades would just take the whole time of the panel. I will be very brief, trying to set the scene. To my left, there is Professor Seraina Grünewald, who is a professor of international economic law and finance law at the University of St. Gallen, Switzerland. She is also a member of the academic board of the European Banking Institute and an academic fellow with the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence on European Union Sustainable Finance Law, and a member of the Committee on International Monetary Law of the International Law Association. So, Seraina, it's a pleasure to have you here. Then with us is also Agnieszka Smolenska, who is an associate researcher at the European Banking Institute. For those of us who follow developments in sustainable finance, she's, one of these wonders. It leaves you wonder how she manages to be so knowledgeable on so many different topics. She's currently triangulating between London, LSE, Florence, EUI, and Warsaw. So welcome, Agnieszka. Then we have with us Roberto Ugena, who is Deputy Director General of Legal Services of the European Central Bank. Formerly, he was the head of the legal department at Banco de España. He's probably one of the people from the legal perspective who can speak with more authority from a practical standpoint on the application of financial, regulatory, and supervisory law. And if I may say so, having listened to him in other conferences, he's also a great presenter and a great speaker. So thank you very much, Roberto. And finally, last but not least, we have with us Tony Ballabriga, who is Global Head of Sustainability, Intelligence and Advocacy at BBVA and Chair of the Sustainable Finance Expert Group at the European Banking Federation. He's also a member of the steering group of the UN Net Zero Banking Alliance, a member of the Commission High-Level Expert Group on Scaling Up Sustainable Finance in Low and Middle-Income Countries, and a member of the Finance Industry Advisory Board of the Energy International Agency. So, as you can gather from the introduction to the different speakers, this is a panel that can speak with authority about the issue that we are going to cover today. The approach that we followed was instead of doing a catalog approach to the different developments in sustainable finance, which only listing them would just cover the whole panel without analyzing anything in depth, we have chosen a specific topic as a central one for our discussion, and we believe it is a central topic because it somehow illustrates the necessary pivot that the European Union authorities, legislators, regulators, supervisors need to make in the following years. And this is the idea of transition finance more broadly, transition plans when it comes to the determination of transition strategies and the assessment of transition risks by financial institutions. This is going to be our core topic for today. The idea is that we address this topic in a relatively dynamic way. Each presenter will be addressing a different question that I will pose to him. And then we will have a short dialogue between the panelists as well as with the audience. This is the structure for this panel. And in that spirit, and I think that to ensure that the audience understands the significance of this topic, the first question is that, I mean, everyone agrees that transition plans are a keystone. Everyone's speaking about transition plans. We need transition plans for a successful market transition and regulatory policy, but the term is used more often than is probably understood. So in that sense, my first question is, when we talk about transition plans, are we always talking about the same things? Do we understand what we are talking about? And the question is for you, Seraina.
Well, thank you very much, David, for the kind introduction. It's a huge pleasure to be speaking here with my colleagues on this panel. And it's, of course, a very relevant question that you're raising. Sorry, no, it's too quick. Yeah. You know, as you can read on my title slide, what I will try to explain briefly in answering your question is that banks may actually find themselves navigating between at least two quite distinct worlds when we speak about transition plans, and I will try to show what these worlds look like. These worlds have to do primarily with the objectives that transition plans aim to fulfill, aim to achieve. And I would like to begin with the world of what I call climate change mitigation, where the objective of climate change or of climate transition plans is to align companies' undertakings, activities with the transition to a 1.5 degrees Celsius world. So it's really an impact-driven objective that these transition plans are pursuing. Now, in fact, most transition plans have a mitigation-centered purpose, or you could even say that the origins of transition plannings are in climate change mitigation. If we look at the Commission recommendation on transition finance, we read that transition plans mean an aspect of the undertaking's overall strategy. So we're talking about strategy-based planning here that lays out the entity's targets and actions for its transition towards a climate neutral or sustainable economy and so forth. Now, similarly, the European Sustainability Reporting Standards expressly state that transition plans relate to the undertaking's efforts in climate change mitigation, and that undertakings are expected to provide a high-level explanation of how they will adjust their strategy. Again, it's about strategy, it's about business model to ensure compatibility with the transition. Now, so for these types of transition plans, the background, at least in Central Europe, clearly is the European Climate Law with its objective of climate neutrality by 2050 and its intermediate objective of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030. In this world, a shift that we can observe is a shift from voluntary to more mandatory transition plans. So what started with private initiatives that you may be well aware of regarding climate and environmental reporting, including, for example, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, many others, and I'm sure the list is not complete, is now turning into a more mandatory framework with recently implemented and potentially upcoming EU legislation. Of course, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that was adopted last year, the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, sort of working out the details of the CSRD framework, and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, where we saw a provisional agreement in December, and then a quite surprising turn earlier this year, where we are still awaiting the final vote in the Council to take place. So what I will do now is to briefly outline what these different pieces of legislation will entail on a very high level, of course, regarding transition plans. Within the CSRD, with the CSRD, I should say, transition plans moved into the framework of the accounting directive. So they became an aspect of corporate sustainability disclosure, and as such might also be relevant to banks as corporates. Importantly, the CSRD requires undertakings to disclose any transition plan they may have. So the CSRD does not create an obligation for undertakings to adopt a transition plan. It merely says or requires companies that do have a transition plan to disclose that transition plan according to the requirements of the CSRD framework. The European Sustainability Reporting Standards, they concretize these disclosure obligations. I'm not going to go into detail here. I'm just going to stress again, these disclosure requirements are focused on climate change mitigation. Of course, the CSRD requires banks and other companies to also disclose financial risks that they were exposed to due to climate change. But this is outside of transition plans. So this is sort of a separate frame. These standards also make clear again that transition plans remain a largely voluntary exercise. It is, there is a certain notch in the standards in that they say, and I quote, "In case the undertaking does not have a transition plan in place, it shall indicate whether, and if so, when it will adopt a transition plan." So, notch, but no obligation here. Now that is, or was, I probably have to say, was about to change. With the adoption of the CSDDD, what you see here is a version that leaked on the 24th of January at 8:39 p.m. There might be later versions available out there. This is the one that I could get hold of. The point is, what the CSDDD would do is to ensure that companies not only adopt, but also put into effect a transition plan for climate change mitigation. So it would supplement the disclosure obligations of the CSRD in that it would add the obligation of the company to put the transition plan into effect that it adopted on a mandatory basis, and also to update it on a yearly basis and to assess progress towards its targets. So it is no longer only about disclosure. It's also about following up. Are we meeting the targets that we set for ourselves and that we disclosed? It's quite a different framing from the CSRD that we're facing here. Important is that these are all best efforts obligations. We are talking about obligations of means, as the draft agreement nicely puts it, not of obligations of result. So let us move from this world of moving towards 1.5 degrees Celsius into the world of climate change adaptation, where the objective is a different one. The objective here is to manage the risks that come with the transition, whatever the transition may ultimately look like. Now, you know, it's common knowledge that climate change and in particular the transition can pose risks to banks' balance sheets. And according to the ECB, there is 80% of euro area banks that have concluded that transition risks do have a material impact on their strategies and risk profiles. But of course, the integration of these risks into the prudential framework has proved challenging. That has to do with the specificities of these risks, particularly the longer time horizons over which they may materialize, where in the prudential framework we have a horizon of 1 to 3 years looking at risks. Here we are dealing with much longer horizons, of course. And their forward-looking nature, in the sense that we have very little past record on which we can build models to actually quantify these risks. Now, transition plans have emerged as a potential semi-technical solution to some of the challenges that are associated with assessing and managing climate-related risks, and the ECB in particular, we will hear more about that from Roberto, has encouraged banks to adopt transition plans in support of their efforts to deal with climate-related risks. What I'm going to focus on is just briefly outline what is happening on the legislative side here. We have the CRD, the Capital Requirements Directive compromise text that mandates banks, so it will be an obligation, to develop and monitor prudential transition plans from this risk perspective. So banks' management bodies will have to develop and monitor the implementation of specific plans, quantifiable targets, and so forth. A point that I want to highlight is that further down in this provision, it says that the prudential transition plans should be consistent with the transition plans under the CSRD where they exist, in particular regarding the business model and strategy of the bank. But of course, the legislator doesn't give us any wisdom on how we should achieve such consistency. So banks will develop and monitor such plans. What is the supervisor going to do with them? I'm not going to say much about that. My colleagues will take care of that. But there is also some elements of enforcement actions built into the framework in that these transition plans will become part of the supervisory review and evaluation process. And there will also be certain follow-up measures that can be taken by bank supervisors. I think I'm going to skip the EBI guidelines because there's too much to be said about that, and I'll actually come to my conclusions. I just wanted to give the overview of the quite intricate regulatory framework that we are dealing with here, that banks are subject to either as corporates or as banks. The green part phrases sort of the climate mitigation world, whereas the gray part is the climate adaptation world. And I'm coming back, concluding here, to the question that you raised, David. Do we know what we talk about when we talk about transition plans? Well, I think reconciling these two worlds of climate change mitigation and adaptation may actually prove quite challenging for banks, and I'm quite curious to hear from our colleagues here from practice how that is actually playing out for them, and that they might need further guidance on how to do so. Now, the reason why I think this might be quite challenging is because when we deal, or when we look at the mitigation world, we have a very clear given scenario. The scenario here is a 1.5 degrees world. And undertakings are expected to work towards that scenario. Whereas in the adaptation world, in the world of risk management, the scenario is unclear. We do not know which scenario is going to materialize. So we have to work with different scenarios in mind. We are expecting banks to plan for different scenarios. Of course, that we work out in elaborate processes with backing from science, the NGFS, providing us with scenarios to work with. But this is still a very different world to navigate in. And in the risk management world, the role of banks is a way more passive one. And it's, in the sense of we're not necessarily working towards a scenario, but we are taking them as a basis for our risk management actions. Secondly, and I'm going to be very brief on that, the meaning of any substantive obligations, any obligations that we are adopting or may see adopted soon to disclose or adopt a transition plan remain unclear or subject to further debate and exploration. Of course, there's different pieces of guidance that are available both in the market and from the regulatory side. I'm thinking in particular of the UK Transition Plan Task Force with its gold standard, and where we're seeing increasing consistency in terms of, what should be topics covered in transition plans. However, these transition plans, or their content and design, of course, continue to adapt. They continue to evolve, also depending on the use cases that they're meant to serve and any potential use cases that may come in the future. I'm thinking of including them in the concentration risk framework, in scenario analysis, but I leave the details of that to my colleagues. So I'll close here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Seraina. I think that one couldn't hope for a more, enlightening introduction, raising the relevant questions. Now, since you already highlighted that the very idea of a transition plan is complicated, it seems to be a moving target, and now for banks, we are adding prudential transition plans on top of the idea of strategic transition plans. I think that we need to understand how the supervisory authority approaches this, because it is like the new issue on the table that can fit nicely into the already existing landscape or may disrupt that landscape. So the supervisory perspective is essential. And Roberto, what is the supervisory perspective on this?
Thanks a lot to the European Banking Institute and to you, David, in particular, for giving me the opportunity to be here today with you to speak a bit about the ECB approach when it comes to climate and environmental related risks, and more specifically about this upcoming task that we will be receiving soon from CRD6 package about monitoring the credit institutions' transition plans. If you allow me, I would like to take a step back before entering into more details about what to expect in terms of transition plans from institutions, from credit institutions, to try to frame the question or this instrument actually as what I said here as a supervisory tool, and more in particular, why actually supervisors should care about climate-related risks more in general. And I think this would allow us to perhaps to locate ourselves in this, one of these two words that Seraina was referring to before, in particular in the word of internal control frameworks, because what we see is that, I mean, for supervisors, irrespective of whether the mandate they have is more or less explicit about climate-related risks, what is true is that we should care about climate events, because what we observe is that climate changes could give rise to financial risks, which may arise from the changes in the weather that may impact economies, the so-called physical risks, through acute physical events or through more chronic type of trends, but also, which is more important for today, perhaps the transition risk drivers coming out from the transition of economy mainly based on fossil fuels to a low carbon economy. So climate-related risk drivers impact banks directly or indirectly because they have an impact on the assets of the banks, on the counterparties of the banks, but also on the economy in which banks operate. And those are the transmission channels that translate these events in the weather or in the climate into financial risk for banks, and it might vary significantly because of geographical reasons, but also because of the existence of amplifiers and mitigants. That said, there seems to be broad agreement among supervisors that despite the distinctive elements of climate-related events, we don't have a new category of risk for banks. What we have is a risk driver that fits into the assessment of the traditional risk that banks are exposed to, mainly credit risk, market risk, liquidity, and operational risk. And this should be perhaps the perspective we should take here. So in a nutshell, we as supervisors care about climate-related risks because they translate into financial risk for our banks. This is the perspective we take. And this is why, at the ECB at least, we did not wait for changes in the legislation to start our journey with regard to climate and environmental risk management, but we started earlier in 2020 with the publication of the guide of the ECB on climate-related and environmental risks, because we believe back then, and we still believe, that this was part already of Article 74 CRD, in the sense that this was part of the requirement to have sound processes and arrangements in the banks to deal with all the risks that they are exposed to, and in particular also with risk drivers as environmental and climate-related events may become. So we took this step to publish this guide in 2020 with a view to enhancing the internal control framework of banks, complementing the traditional view on the different categories of risks by considering also these new risk drivers coming out from climate-related events. The guide contained expectations around business models and strategy, governance and risk appetite, and also about disclosure as well, about disclosure on the, thanks to the hook that material disclosures requirements of CRR offer. But we didn't stop there. What we did afterwards was to ask banks a bit of a self-reflection exercise. So banks were requested to assess themselves against the standards and the benchmarks provided in the guide, to check where they were. And after reviewing the letters, the self-assessment letters of the banks, we provided them with our feedback, with our view, the view of the supervisor about how we saw their standing when it comes to the control framework with regard to climate-related events. In 2022, I'm going to be quick because this is already known, but just allow me to go through the different milestones that we have achieved so far. We conducted a thematic review and a stress test. The stress test, I have to say, was more a learning exercise for everyone, for banks, but also for us, because it was a bit of a pioneer initiative on our side, and actually the results in quantitative terms should not be taken at face value. So, I mean, banks reported in total, I think, around 70 billion of losses, which is something that doesn't sound really credible in terms of the magnitude and size of the events that may materialize in these aspects, in this context. But still, it was a valuable exercise to continue learning some lessons about how to deal this type of new risk drivers. And last year, we continue our engagement with banks, monitoring the progress made in this journey of enhancing internal control framework. And we have stepped up our supervisory action now by requiring in a binding manner banks the remediation of some comments that we have seen. And also we are ready to follow up with even enforcement action in case of lack of compliance if we don't see good progress achieved in this context. So it's not completely updated, the results that I'm going to present, but it's the latest one that we have published. How we see the situation now, I put the picture of a glass half empty, as you see there, for you to decide on which side you would like to see more water or less, because what we see is that after these efforts, indeed, progress have been made, enormous progress have been made, because actually we are talking about only 2 years, more or less. Now, 85 of our banks in the community of banks that are supervised by the ECB as significant banks, they present at least what we call basic practices around the management of these type of risk drivers. And we have actually some banks with leading practices that are exemplary around the world. But still, we have 59% of our banks not integrating still climate risk into their stress testing framework, which is something that they will have to do now once CRD6 provisions came into force, after, of course, national implementation. We have also seen some progress in disclosures. We have, Seraina mentioned before, I think more than 80% of banks reporting material exposures to climate and environmental risks. But we see also that only 6% out of those really provide adequate information in the different categories. We have 50% already providing information about amount of emissions that they finance, but still the information is not specific enough or sometimes is not complete enough. That said, not to be very critical here, we have to acknowledge as well that European banks are still pioneers in the sense that they disclose much more than other international peers do. So, because of this, there is still some long way to go. And what we are now doing is specifying deadlines where we would like banks to align with our expectations. Some of them have already passed, others are coming. We are in the process of monitoring now the progress made. And as I said before, we are ready to step up the supervisory reaction also by taking enforcement measures as periodic penalty payments in case of lack of compliance with binding requirements. This is a bit what we have done and we did before CRD6 transition plans were agreed upon. And this is the novelty that we have from CRD6. And I will now try to explain a bit how we see CRD transition plans, which are plans that have to be considered or seen as an internal control tool. It's not an alignment tool. This is important. Here, the expectation for us is not to enforce compliance with Paris objectives. For us, the perspective is that banks are prepared to handle the risk that may come from misalignment of the objectives, with the objectives of the Paris Agreement because of the different risk drivers that may feed into the traditional categories of risk, in particular credit risk, but also market risk. So, firstly, institutions will have to identify and measure environmental and governance, by the way, and social related risk, because in the CRD world, we are very much focused on climate, but also we have to be mindful that social and governance related risks are also there, and they prove much more difficult really to face because we are less advanced in this area. So some work we will have to do as well in this part, but I will focus more on the environmental part of the problem. So they will be required banks to identify and measure based on sound data processes. I will refer also to the issue of data a bit later. And the combination of methodologies. The EBA is expecting in the draft guidelines that have been published to public consultation last January, that the methodologies would include exposure-based, portfolio-based, and scenario-based methodology. So these three dimensions, because again, as Seraina alluded to before, this is a type of risk driver that is a bit difficult to monitor and to identify and measure in view of the characteristics that it has in terms of time horizon, unprecedented nature, and the rest. I will refer to this a bit later as well when I speak about the challenges ahead for us. But it's not only about identifying and measuring, of course, it's also about managing those risks and mitigating to the extent possible. And the expectation here is that this should occur over a longer time horizon. It's not only about the usual short or medium-term perspective of supervisors of banks, so we are well beyond the 1 year framework that we have usually for our P2R calculations, the 3 years framework for our P2G calculations, or the 3 to 5 years business cycle for banks. We are even going into the territory of at least 10 years, which is really a big challenge in terms of uncertainty that these scenarios may bring about. The banks will have to embed ESG risk, in the definition of the risk appetite framework, but also in the usual internal processes of banks when it comes to controls, like the internal capital adequacy assessment process or the internal liquidity adequacy assessment process, the so-called ICAP and ILAP. And all of these should be complemented with the requirement on banks to develop transition plans, the CRD transition plans or prudential plans. And this is perhaps one of the big novelties of CRD 6 package. Transition plans take a risk-based view, so they are expected to contribute to enhance the resilience of banks towards this type of risk. So it's an internal control tool. This is the conception that we have for them. They should be understood according to the EBA guidelines, the draft guidelines that have been published, as an overview and articulation of strategic actions and risk management tools, so both components, based on a forward-looking business environmental analysis to ensure that banks are ready and are robust enough for the transition towards a more sustainable economy. And they should include setting targets and milestones at regular intervals. And they should be embedded in the institution's strategy and risk management. The new provisions also go on in allocating responsibilities. The expectation in the EBA guideline is that the development, implementation, and monitoring of plans should be clearly allocated internally in the bank, and the management body is expected to be responsible for the approval of transition plans, responsible also for overseeing those transition plans, the implementation of those, of being regularly informed, and also of taking decisions when they are needed to ensure the implementation of remedial actions in case of significant deviations between the targets and the performance. But this is then cascade down into the typical model of 3 lines of defense. The first line of defense is expected to enter into a dialogue with counterparties to understand better transition plans and assess consistency of the transition plans of banks' counterparties with institutions' transition planning. And this is very important in the end because, this is the channel of transmission of the risk. So, and banks will be more or less exposed also depending on how exposed counterparties are to this type of risk. And this is why, despite transition plans not being an alignment tool, they may have an impact, of course, and they will have an impact in ensuring also aligning, I guess. The compliance function is also expected to take an active role, ensuring that risk limits are consistent with all the institution plans, including sectoral policies, and here could also play a role in the consistency with 2 minutes only. Okay, I will be quicker, sorry. With transition plans of the institution itself, and also the internal audit function is expected to have a role, as usual, I would say. As I said, they should include targets at institution level, but also at sectoral and portfolio level, depending on the assessment of materiality of the exposures to specific sectors or the materiality of specific exposures. And importantly, they should be based on different scenarios. And it's the issue that Seraina alluded to. And very quickly, to sum up, I would like to highlight the difficulties of the work to come in this context, because firstly, an issue with data. Of course, we will have better and more reliable data after the CSRD, so the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive being into force, but still, we need to be mindful that it doesn't cover all the spectrum, and SMEs without listed instruments will not be required to disclose, which means that we will have a hole there in terms of data. We also lack a clear, a less binary classification, because what we have now is clearly the green label, but we don't know what happens beyond the green label in terms of having neutral or more harmful or less harmful environmentally exposures. And also, there will be a lot of uncertainty that complicates the whole analysis, because, as I said before, the traditional approach is to look into the past. So we have always a backward-looking approach, relying on historical data. Here, historical data are not so relevant. So we have a bit of unprecedented events that cannot be extrapolated from the past, as usual. They are non-linear, which means that the usual approach of modeling variables is not so relevant here either. And they are geographically diverse. And they have to be assessed in the context of a longer horizon that we are used to, in at least 10 years, which complicates the thing further. This will require from banks and also from supervisors, I say, an adaptation in terms of the mindset, but also the need to acquire knowledge and expertise that perhaps we don't currently have in our staff. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roberto. Don't think of me as unkind for checking the time up. You will have time for reactions after the different speakers. So it seems that we are getting somewhere. So do we know what we talk about when we talk about transition plans? We seem to mean two things, right? One strategic, one risk-based. Roberto expanded on the risk-based dimension, but but in the end, it's the bank that has to draft the transition plan. And perhaps I think that Tony, who is, leads the team at BBVA, which is one of the pioneering institutions when it comes to sustainable finance, will know what are the challenges. And perhaps that what we call prudential transition plan is not a transition plan. So if I may ask, the floor is yours. Thank you.
On climate. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. No, I said that thanks for the invitation, and very proud to be here with my colleagues, and congrats to the organization to have a panel session focused on transition plans, which is the most famous word that we have now in climate and finance. No? Well, first, let's say that I will share the perspective from a practitioner point of view, how this is being, let's say, work and implemented in a bank, in this case, that we are based in Madrid, but we have very strong also presence in emerging economies, the challenge that we face. And this is a learning process. This is a long journey. We released, in fact, our first initial transition plan last year. And we are going to publish in a few weeks our second version, showing our progress. And maybe as coming back a little bit provocative on the first presentation that has been, the first two presentations that have been very clear, no? Maybe more generally speaking, we did a mistake, no? Try to use the same words for two different things. So maybe we should agree first that one thing is transition plan, another thing is climate risk plan, or maybe that would help a lot, especially within banks, no? Because when you have to explain transition plan, they say, well, but Tony, what is exactly the transition plan? So I think that's something that we should take into account because it's confusing the market. So I'm going to share now what we have done and what we are our progress. So first, let me say that the first approach that we have at the Net Zero Transition Plan is a strategic one. So is let's say a document that when we set our goals, actions, and accountability mechanisms to align our activity to a net zero scenario. So it's focusing on impact, as you say, no? But we understand that this document is in line with the CRRD and also in line with the CRSD, as you said, no? It's at an entity level. It is good to an effective communication with our stakeholders, with our investors, with our and also other stakeholders, and it helps in some way, obviously, how to understand manage risk. But let's comment later about risk management. Okay. So we have to do that. What we have done is that we have followed a framework that was mentioned also before, the G-Funds framework, which they release guidelines on transition plans at the strategic level, at entity level, building in these 5 pillars: foundations, implementation of strategy, engagement of strategy, governance and metrics and targets. And I'm going to use this framework to explain what we are doing, the steps that we are doing, and how we are explaining to our stakeholders how we understand our transition plan. No? So the first part is, in these guidelines are, what are the objectives, the priorities in our institution. No? In our case, we understand the net zero journey as a huge business opportunity. There will be a massive capital reallocation that needs to be done, a huge investment needs to be done, 8% of GDP year after year, if you want to achieve that scenario. So for bank, it's a business opportunity to help our clients and the whole economy to transition. So that's the reason why we have set a target on sustainable finance mobilization. And also we have also committed to the net zero 2050 on our finance emissions. And we have already set targets in 8 sectors that are let's say the most intensive sectors. We are planning to set targets also to real estate and agribusiness next year. No? So these are the 2 main, let's say, objectives that we have. We want to help our economy in this transition, and we want to align our activity with this scenario net zero. And that's the first message. The second pillar is about the products and services that we have in place, the activities and decision making, about policies and conditions that we have. These are the, let's say, the following the framework from G-Funds, no? And well, we understand that it's not only to paint of green our balance sheet, it's how we advise our clients, provide solutions, not only pure green solutions, but also, as I said before, helping the whole economy to transition, also those sectors difficult to abate, because we have to help the transformation from and if they have a credible transition plan, we have to be there if it has economic sense. So the target is not reduce our finance emissions. The target is finance the reductions emissions from our clients. So this is our approach, and I think it's very, very important because it will be easier to reduce simply our finance emissions, simply exiting from some sectors, and we are not going to solve the problem. So that's very important. And a key message also here in this line is that this is not only about the big corporates, this is also enterprise and SMEs and retail clients. We are doing a huge effort to mainstream this and great capillarity also for middle-sized companies. No? So to give you an example, last year we closed 30,000 deals in middle-cap companies, let's say companies from 10 million to 500 million euros turnover. We have done 30,000 sustainable deals in our footprint. So this is going mainstream. It's not only about a few hundred of clients. We have to help the whole economy. No? So then another key piece on this pillar is how we approach decarbonization strategy and the different tools and let's say different methodologies that we are implementing to ensure that we have that management. We are managing that impact. No? First, what we have is sectoral plans. We call sectoral alignment plans, not sectoral risk plans. no? Sector alignment plans. In all these sectors that we have set targets, we understand which are the key drivers of each sector in terms of opportunities, but also in terms of risk related to the net zero scenario. And then we have, and this is updated every year, and then we have specific tools that I'm going to focus a little bit later in one of them, which is the transition risk indicator that we use to assess our clients in all these sectors. And also other tools like What If. Today, we score, let's say 90% of our clients in those 8 sectors have a TRI. And when we have to go to a committee to approve any loan for one of those 500 clients we have in those sectors, has to come with obviously a risk credit assessment, but together with the TRI assessment. And we take a decision. And even we have the What If tool, which is a tool where we see the impact in our pathway and in the pathway of the client, how will affect that deal in our portfolio, so we can assess the sensitivity in terms of impact, no, for us. So I think it's good tools to understand that this is not only a one-year exercise, it's something that is already happening on a daily basis, embedding this impact dimension into our decision making. And I think that is really quite significant. No? And to provide you an example, this is the TRI. So we assess we have practically 95% of our lending portfolios in these sectors covered by TRI for our clients. The TRI assess the reporting from our clients in terms of their client strategy. So we use the TCFD framework to assess governance, risk management, strategy, and also metrics. But then also we use what we call carbon transition assessment, which is more forward-looking assessment. So how technology and regulation will impact in our clients' plans, how the measures they are taking to mitigate that, the CAPEX, which is the acid test, the CAPEX they are going to show us that they are going to invest in the transition. And all in, we make an assessment from 1 to 9 of all our clients. No? And this scoring is something that, as I said, is integrated into our decision making. On the right side of the screen, you see in key sectors where we have the greatest exposure. No? So we have advanced clients, strong, moderate, and poor. And well, you see that the oil and gas is where you have more exposure on moderate, because we really see that there is no clear credibility yet on the transition plans we see in the market. No? But this is a tool that helps us a lot to make the type of assessment on the transition plan. No? But beyond impact, we are embedding, obviously, climate into our risk management. No? And from the strategy, from the risk appetite framework to internal taxonomies, to our policies that we have in different portfolios at the wholesale banking, but also on the retail assets, and how this is integrated into different pieces. No? And so we are already integrating some metrics, for instance, on the RAF, to understand how much of our clients have a certain exposure to certain sectors, or even we have embedded already the targets that we have into our RAF in terms of decarbonization targets. No? But this is a long way. I mean, but we are focusing this more broadly, but then focusing at sector level. Maybe at the end we will comment a little bit, because our feeling is that we have to have a transition plan at entity level as a strategic document to understand how this links to the strategy and all connected. Obviously, we have to connect the climate risk into all our risk management processes. And maybe what we have to do is, obviously, we have to have prudential plans or risk-focused plans at sector level, at portfolio level. In those 8 sectors where we have to make this assessment, not only with the IEA net zero scenario, but with all scenarios and with these different timeframes. And that, in our opinion, is the place where we should put this prudential approach at the portfolio level. And as we see the EBA guidelines that has been released, we understand that there's a room for that. No? So obviously connect everything in the risk management, but focusing at portfolio level when we talk about climate risk plans at prudential level. So, well, finally, another pillar that is on this framework of defense is about engagement with our clients. I have explained it a little bit, because with our clients we can comment later, but we engage them in all what we do, but also we participate in engagement with industry and with the governments and other initiatives to promote the systemic change that we need. No? So this is something very relevant when we When we have to have a transition plan, this also creating clear signals to other stakeholders to take their role. No? And yeah, finally, we have metrics. These are the metrics we use for the first goal, sustainable finance mobilization. And also we have metrics on the second goal about net zero. So we have sector by sector, we have set a target by 2030. And here you have already the performance that we have. For instance, in oil and gas, we have a metric to reduce 30% of our finance emissions from oil and gas, absolute emissions, and we have already reduced in 3 years 24%. So well, it seems that we are on track. Or in coal, or other sectors like power generation. In power generation, the intensity of CO2 per kilowatt produced, our clients have reduced on average 24% in the latest 3 years. No? So these are the metrics that we use to assess impact, and it's a critical part of our transition plan. No? And finally, the governance piece. We obviously, sustainability is reported at the board level. We have a sustainability area reporting to the chair and to the CEO, members of the global leadership, to help the transformation of the whole bank. We have also a steering alignment group, which is the body that oversees the targets and the performance and so on. And well, we have embedded these mobilization and decarbonization targets into our variable compensation. Not only on the short term, but also on the long-term compensation. 50% of our long-term compensation is linked to these decarbonization targets. No? And then the relevance of the culture. No? And some final messages, no? To conclude. So we have to understand that our role as banks, we are the middlemen. So we depend on others to achieve this successful transition. No? We depend on governance policies, and I'm not talking only about taxonomies, and not only talking about disclosure, sustainable finance regulation. No, I'm talking about industry policies, ambition from the countries, NDCs that are really, really consistent with the ambition that they declare when they go to COPs. So this is what we need. So we depend on our clients. We are not investing. It's our clients that are investing. We help our clients to invest. So we can influence, but we are the middleman. And so sometimes this is, forget it. And some stakeholders don't understand that this is what happens. No? So then also, it's important, as Roberto said, data. That's the reason why we celebrate that through another route, we are going to have transition plans, let's say mandatory for our clients, because we need transition plans because our transition plans will be an aggregated view of transition plans for our clients. So we need transition plans from our clients. Obviously, again, the distinction between risk and this strategic approach, as I said, I would prefer to have two different namings because it will help. And that's the reason why, and the final point is, we think they are complementary views. So we need a strategic approach to transition. If we want to be aligned with net zero, and we need to have a transition plan on that, but obviously we need embed into our risk management the climate risk, the transition and adaptation risk, through all the different tools and the different processes and so on. And also focusing at sector level, at portfolio level, we think is the place where we can have, let's say, a climate risk plan instead of transition plan. I leave it here. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Tony, for a really enlightening presentation of the view from how do you actually do this in practice. So if I had to summarize the three interventions, it would be 2 transition plans, a peculiar transition plan, no transition plan, and then since we have our 4 presentations, so Agnieszka can more or less take on board some of the messages to see whether no transition plans, peculiar transition plan, or maybe whatever you want to call it, but the answers to some supervisory limitations. So my question to you would be, to what extent this new idea of transition plans, and especially prudential transition plans, may be the answer to some of the shortcomings that have been observed in supervisory law and practice when it comes to climate-related risks? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, David. And indeed, the challenge of coming at the end of such a wonderful panel is that there will be some repetitions, but I only hope that this will only help to solidify this new information in the world of transition plans. I think what comes out, and I will just start with my presentation with this, and I will go over indeed again a little bit what are the transition plans in the prudential context. But I think there are already kind of 4 themes that really materialize in this context. So first, an evolution of our approach to risk. So transition risk really seems to be something different from what we've seen before. And we are still figuring out what it is and what are the implications in terms of identifying what is material for the purpose of measuring. And so the question of data, proxies, do we have the data about the future, how we assess transition risk, and what do we do to mitigate transition risk through engagement with clients, through more green lending. And all of this obviously has implications for supervisory transformation. So we are really asking supervisors to do something quite different now in terms of the organization and scope of supervisory processes. So there are also a lot of entanglements between the different frameworks. So we are in the world, at this panel, in this esteemed group, we are surely in the group of fans of banking regulation, but in the space of transition plans, we are not just thinking about banking regulation, we are thinking about sectoral legislation. We are now becoming all experts in energy performance certificates and energy efficiency regulation and automotive regulation of combustion engines, right? So the question is also all of these challenges of integrating the world, basically, and the transition of the world within the world of prudential regulation. So we are all here to learn. Starting a little bit again from this question of what is transition, and even though we've heard it in many different contexts, I just wanted to draw on the European Commission guideline to emphasize that the starting point is absolutely alignment with the Paris Agreement 1.2 and specifically the objectives articulated in the EU climate law, but it's also about climate change adaptation and other environmental objectives, right? So this is the scope of transition of what we are thinking when we are thinking about the transition is very relevant. So what came out of the presentation so far is largely the climate change mitigation aspect, but transition as such is broader. Now, there is this initial idea of a transition plan that is really about a detailed multi-year account of targets and actions that sets out how a given firm will ensure that its business model and strategy are compatible with a specific objective. So that's the alignment approach to transition plans focused on climate change mitigation. But we have this new concept of prudential transition plans that is emerging, that is, as Roberto already mentioned, defined in a little bit of an ambiguous way, I think you can say, in the consultation from the EBA. So I also expect that there will be a lot of discussion on these few lines in responses to the consultation. So EBA suggested that it's an overview and articulation of strategic action and risk management tools. And this juxtaposition of strategy and risk management is indeed, as David already pointed us to, the key core of a lot of these discussions, deployed by institutions based on a forward-looking business environmental analysis to demonstrate how an institution ensures its robustness, not credibility, robustness, and preparedness for the transition towards climate and environmentally resilient and sustainable economy. Okay, but how did we get here? And I wanted to start a little bit again with this, with the different functions of transition plans that we see. So we started in the transition planning space really from the initial pledges that banks were making around all these different COPs. Banks were coming with alliances saying we'll all be net zero by 2050. And then people started to ask, okay, what does it mean? Can you substantiate a little bit in more detail what that actually implies in terms of your governance, in terms of the decisions that you will take internally? So we had a swathe of these market-led GFANs approaches that were more strategy-focused, very broad scope, publicly available. Subsequently, we've seen the development of mandatory corporate disclosures. So supervisors, especially on the market conduct side, are going to be looking at the corporate disclosures, such as the ones under the CSRD and CSDDD that Seraina mentioned. But there is something about transition plans that made them of particular interest to prudential supervisors. And the reason is that transition plans help, and I will come back to this, help to address a number of shortcomings of our current way of thinking about climate change risks in the microprudential framework. So they are a useful new tool to overcome the constraints of the existing approach. Now, there is a key distinction to be made between transition planning and transition plans. Another distinction as we try to, unpick this very complex area. And this differentiates between an internal process within the bank, so the process of how a bank develops the strategy to deliver on climate targets and prepare a long-term response to manage risks associated with transitions, and the transition plans themselves that are a concrete document. And we've seen some insights from the BBVA, but I also will present some brief tables of other transition plans just so that we see that this stuff is already out there. So we can be discussing these forward-looking regulatory requirements, but banks are already disclosing a lot. And there is obviously the question of what risks they are subject to as a result of these disclosures. So as we move from this mandatory, corporate disclosure-based regime towards the prudential one for the banking sector, a lot of international supervisory networks are also getting involved. NGFS survey and a stocktake that Seraina mentioned already has identified that while supervisors are not quite sure what to do with these transition plans globally, most of them are quite convinced that this has something to do with risk management and therefore are keen to get involved. So what we did in a report published a year and a half ago with colleagues at the LSE was to look at the prudential problems that transition plans are meant to solve. And it's true, we might have complicated a little bit the naming sphere by using transition plans as the name for all these different types of documents, but we did add prudential in front of transition plans, so that's one. Our starting point was really something broader that is happening within the prudential framework. So we've already had a lot of movement on the Pillar 3 in particular in the EU. So since 2019, we have, there was the mandate to develop the Pillar 3 disclosures under the microprudential framework with 2 years ago, Pillar 3 ESG implementing technical standards developed by EBA, which already deal a lot with transition risk disclosures, already deal as well with mitigation aspects. So there are specific disclosures on green asset ratio, for example, as a transition risk mitigation measure. We've seen less movement before the reform, that is, we are waiting for the final text of the CRD on the Pillar 2 front, but of course there are some supervisors in the EU, notably the ECB, but also Bank of Hungary, that have really used the discretionary space within the regulatory framework to incorporate also thinking about transition planning and transition risk mitigation into their supervisory processes already. On the pillar 1, least movement so far in terms of in terms of regulatory capital implications, although EBA's 2023 recommendations suggest methodological adjustments, and as we know, methodology can somehow sometimes even move things further ahead than formal rules can, in the short term at least. So what are the limitations of the framework that prudential transition plans can can help overcome? So climate and environmental risk factors are beyond doubt already drivers of transitional risk categories, credit market risk in particular, but they also have features that make them more difficult to catch within the existing approaches. So this is the longer time horizon, although as we see the news, maybe this longer time horizon for some physical risks has somewhat shortened. But there is also complexity and trade-offs between the different dimensions, physical transition risk aspects. Limited effectiveness of backward-looking risk management approaches, so we need something to help us imagine the future and think about the possible risks that can materialize as a result of the accelerated process of transition. And we have the lack of quality data, so a lot of innovation and proxies happening in that space. So supervisory assessment of bank transition plans can, in this sense, complement this forward scenario analysis and stress testing and help overcome some of these limitations. How can this happen? And we differentiate kind of 3 different ways there. So first of all, it's the overcoming of the tragedy of the horizon. So how do you bring the future transition risks medium term, longer term to the present? You look at misalignment. So that's a little bit the quote unquote trick that has been done within the EU microprudential framework with the prudential transition plan requirement under Article 76. So the idea there is that in order for these transition risks to bring them closer to us today, we look at how a bank is misaligned from a particular transition pathway. That is, of course, assuming, and this is something that always comes up in discussion, to what extent we can assume that all of the policies that governments are committing to will actually be implemented, but we are nonetheless kind of expecting banks to act as if at least they are thinking about what will happen if all of the ambitious targets are meaningfully pursued. There is also this longer-term risk dimension. So we see now with the revision of the microprudential framework that EBA's original recommendations from 2021 report on ESG risk management were already incorporated, so we have this longer horizon of 10 years. And then one area where we might expect also a lot of movement or a lot of interest is the macro dimension of prudential transition plans, which is something we haven't touched upon yet. But clearly, once a supervisor has this overview of the different types of transition plans across the financial sector, that provides quite unique insight into the state of the sector as a whole. So what do TP's transition plans currently look like? I will skip this as a result of David's signaling, but this we've seen already. So the GFANS methodology, which is pursued by a number of banks, this is mostly alignment focused, right? So, but the very interesting report from the ECB on the net zero transition plans shows there are a lot of risk, especially reputational risks related. And there is a lot of insights to be drawn from looking at how these plans look already, especially with regard to a bank's tendency, for example, to be very selective in the sectors that they pick as sectors of that they are interested in terms of setting specific targets, the kind of scenarios that they use, metrics that they use, etc. So these are already available, different documents. Okay. So what could a robust bank transition plan look like? And that's clearly the question that we are now asking ourselves as EBA is developing these specific guidelines, guidelines that are consulting on aspects such as materiality assessment. So how do you identify, for example, which sectors a bank should be looking at in order to assess how its transition risks exposure and possible, and then defining mitigation aspects, horizons, so targets and consistency among the different frameworks and the different transition plans. The EBA is also consulting on governance aspects, scenario planning and transition planning, especially as regards engagement with clients, which is, as we've heard from Tony, also a key part of this framework, although that, of course, then raises the question how the supervisor will be supervising the relationship between the clients and the bank on transition planning. So what we did in that report was develop a framework for trying to think about the expectations that supervisors need to set. So this is very much something that is currently happening with the EBA guidelines in terms of setting minimum standards, timelines, targets, milestones, reference pathways. As I mentioned, there is a lot of gaming that happens already with regard to the scenarios, metrics, and targets that are being set by different banks. So the supervisors and regulators will have a key role in removing the scope for arbitrage, but also obviously greenwashing, and setting quantitative and qualitative assessment methodologies, methods as well. How the assessment will look is of key importance, so how supervisors will meaningfully engage with these documents in terms of assessing the alignment of individual banks and in terms of their risks, misalignment risks, but also at an aggregate financial stability level. What is also, I will need 2 minutes more, David. What is also really interesting is that the CRD introduces an amendment that possibly involves other types of agencies in the assessment of the prudential transition plans. So it's not just financial stability related knowledge, it's also other types of environmental, for example, insights that will be needed for supervisors to meaningfully assess and engage with the assumptions and implications of prudential transition plans. And then, obvious as ever, consequences, any kind of regulatory tool is as good as the stick that comes with it. So the question of Pillar 2, different types of sanctions in terms of what supervisors can require of the bank. Instead of conclusions, I will just throw some points for discussion then. So definitely this question of risk management and alignment objectives is something that comes up over and over again in the context of transition planning. So we have this, there are these approaches which kind of juxtapose business strategy aspect and risk management aspects. This has clear implications for supervisors in terms of the toolbox at their disposal, depending. So this is not surprising that this is such a contentious aspect. Another open question is the viability of using the green taxonomy as in terms of thinking about transition risk mitigation. So should we be asking banks, for example, to set targets in terms of green taxonomy alignment as a transition risk mitigation approach? I think there is some thinking that goes in that direction, but that has, I think, big implications. We are already stretching a little bit the macroprudential approach with the double materiality, but that might be taking it a step further. Yes, this internal governance impact and really ensuring that the prudential transition plans are not just one department that sits in a tower far away from the operational decisions and those that are working within the bank with the specific clients. and not just one, maybe I just leave one, and the other topics we can bring up in the discussion is the question of cross-border cooperation and consistency. So the prudential transition planning framework in particular is very EU anchored in EU objectives, anchored in EU transition policies, but there are a lot of banks such as the BBVA that operate globally. So this is how the implications that these prudential transition plans will have for cross-border capital flows and international risk management is something that it definitely would be great to discuss. And I'm sorry if I've been too long. Thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss.
Thanks very much, Agnieszka. Certainly, I think that was the kind of comprehensive presentation that one could hope for at the end. We had a different session planned because we were planning to start earlier, but we started more than 30 minutes late through no fault of our own. So that means that we will have to skip perhaps the exchanges, but I asked the public for forbearance and also to open the floor if there are any questions. I would say that it's the right thing to do. So questions from the audience?
So thank you. Can you hear me? Or, yeah, so thank you for the very interesting presentations. What struck me is indeed, of course, the points that are touched upon again and again is the data issues, is the misalignment, perhaps the issues we have all seem to somehow track back maybe to the original choice to choose climate and environmental risk as drivers of the traditional risk families, whereas we push them into the framework of the other risk management. We expect them to have the same standard of data and whatever to quantify them. Should we not still, I know it's maybe a bit of a past station, but think of climate risk as its own risk family that could be considered on its own? And should we then also not, especially in light of the prudential transition plans, they seem to indeed talk about misalignment, and it's a very long horizon. And these seem to be the transition risks that are also very hard to quantify right now. Should we also not look more towards macroprudential policy to still tackle these risks, whereas they seem to be a bit pressed indeed in the microprudential framework?
Any takers among our panelists? So it would seem like a supervisory or a practical question for starters, then but perhaps we can start on that side.
Well, I could try from the supervisory perspective. We are still convinced that despite all the peculiarities, uncertainties around them, they are risk drivers and not new categories of risk. If you look at them, they really materialize in the traditional categories. So what happens is they affect the income of borrowers, so credit risk. They may affect the value of collateral, credit risk. They may bring about changes in fluctuation in prices in markets, market risk, or finally they may imply a disaster at the premises of the bank, operational risk. So it's difficult to not look from the traditional perspective of supervisors when if you look at the materialization in financial terms of what we call climate and environmental related events, what we talk about is the traditional events that the bank may face because of the activity. The drivers, the root causes may be different, but in the end, the materialization is on the same fields that we have worked with since many years ago. On the second question, on the macroprudential side, I do think that there is a space indeed to think about this more thoroughly. Actually, if I recall correctly, the ECB, in its opinion, with regard to the CRD6 package, also mentioned the possibility to explore further the use of the systemic risk buffer in this context. The difficulty, of course, is again how to use it. Because sometimes it's not so easy to identify sectors, exposures, so that when you enter into the details of how to make it operational, it becomes more tricky. This is one thing. Second thing, as you know, the governance around macroprudential buffer setting in Europe is not straightforward, let me put it this way. So we have all this allocation of competences between national authorities and top-up powers of the ECB, but only for the SSM area. So this complicates the thing further. But indeed, I think there could be a space for further reflection about the use of macroprudential buffers, because what is true is that there are common drivers that affect horizontally with no matter who the final borrower is, the transactions and the exposures of banks. And this could be also treated from the perspective of concentration risk, but sometimes could go well beyond concentration, affect more globally the economy, which is then calling more for macroprudential action. Yeah.
Short reaction, just.
So on the risk categories, I full agreement that we have now developed this approach of CNDE as drivers of traditional risk categories, and this is just happening also, right? But I think it's one of these examples where we have the cake and we ate it. So we also have a separate ESG definition coming through now in the CRR. It already annexed to the ESG Pillar 3 disclosures had an ESG risk definition. So we also have a special definition that allows us to think through double materiality lens, right? So there is a little bit of this double approach here. And on the macroprudential instruments, so what I try to also draw attention to was that prudential transition planning can help us see these concentrations, large exposures, and indeed the CRR now clarifies that systemic risk buffer is also applicable in the context of climate change specifically. So perhaps even if it stays at the national level, someone will experiment. I'm fingers crossed.
Okay. There's one question there.
Maybe the following question. I mean, you started from the Paris goals, so we want to reduce CO2 emissions. So for example, one could set a budget and run it down to zero and sell it off. So we do that for part of the economy, right? And so that's very clear in terms of the direction, right? And then what are risks? So aside from climate change causing risks, how one pursues this path, I think there are substantial risks both from regulation, I mean basically the laws which are passed to achieve that path. They can change, right? You have one country which says, well, we're going to use nuclear power as one of the components. Another country says that's not allowed here. Well, with a change of government, that can change. Or one country says, yes, carbon capture is a good idea. So if you use natural gas and you capture the carbon, that's a good technology to put us on this emission reduction path, but that can change. So climate policy decisions introduce substantial risk because all of these companies are out there. We're doing a lot of investment projects to reduce emissions, right? And these investment projects are, so for example, investing in one technology. And so both the regulation vis-a-vis which technology or whether it's just the emissions are just priced or certain technologies are not allowed changes, and the technologies themselves change, right? So in a few years, we might have other options for saving emissions. So one company may get a big bank loan and say, we're going to build a wind power park offshore, but it may turn out very good in emission reduction, but totally unprofitable. And it will not be able to pay back the loan, and the bank will have a big problem. And as supervisor, you should be looking at it, right? That should force them to build up some capital against those risks. So I'm wondering where these technological and climate policy emanating risks, where those would be considered in the frameworks.
So how to plan for that disorderly transition, right?
Well, that's just, the world is, I mean, we're living in a disorderly world. I mean, that's the point. I mean, if you want to say, let's not have technological change, or let's not have correction of ineffective policies, right? We would be orderly but very ineffective.
So I think that both Tony and Seraina asked for the floor. So in whichever, okay.
No, I mean, yeah. Well, in an assessment that we do at the sector level and at counterparty level, technology is a key driver, no? So it's absolutely critical to, and also is a new set of knowledge for banks because we have to understand better technologies, having a forward-looking approach to advise our clients. So technology is absolutely a core competency now for banks to provide the right advice to our clients. So having said that, the transition will only happen if it has economic sense and if it is fair. If not, they are not going to happen. And today we have technologies that have economic sense with no green premium, let's say renewables, let's say energy efficiency, even mobility in some, not everywhere, but and here we need governments to provide policies for faster permitting, to deploy data scale, and also to emerging economies as well. But then there are another layer of technologies that haven't been discovered yet, and we have too high green premium to produce green steel, to produce green cement, to produce sustainable aviation fuels on a competitive for shipping, transport, and all these we need to invest in innovation. And again, governments need to create the right environment to create the right incentives to attract private capital at a scale, to innovate, and reduce the green premium. And it's the only way that those technologies will be the winners in the new economy. And it will make sense to invest in those economies. So I would say only to say that technology is absolutely critical, and maybe in the past we saw that as a given data point in our assessment, but now it's something that is embedded into this transformation. So we have to learn a lot, we have to connect a lot. The conversations that we have more add value with our clients is a conversation about technology challenges that they have and how we can provide investment. Sometimes, well, through different mechanisms, we can go and support them. So I would say that technology for me is something that is not to solve everything, because then we have the just transition piece, which is absolutely also critical, no? And governments need to tackle that to leave no one behind, not only in developed economies in Europe, but also in emerging economies. So it's also a just transition angle, no? But technology, in order to have this economic sense, is absolutely critical. So, well, only to a reflection where we are now. And it's not about philanthropy, it's not about, no, it's something that we need to have economic sense to promote this business at the scale that we need, no? That's simple as that.
Seraina, you had a quick reaction and then...
A very quick one. I can obviously only add to this interesting perspective from practice, sort of from a bird's eye view, in the sense of, obviously a big part of the discussion that is ongoing is precisely on, what are credible assumptions that can be made? What are, when are external factors, how can they factor into a bank's planning, both in terms of alignment, but also in risk terms? So the dependency in the alignment world on of the ambition on too many or unlikely assumptions is a big question. Like carbon removals, will we have the technologies available? I think there's a lot of green wishing ongoing there, I assume, from bank side. So I think this is really a key point that you're raising, both when we speak about, what scenarios do we underlie when we speak about risks, but also what key assumptions are we basing our alignment decisions on.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for all the panelists for the very enlightening presentations. Thanks to the audience for really pertinent questions. I think that we can close this panel saying, optimistically that we had a lot of questions, but also, I would say, some tentative answers to some important issues. Thank you very much.